We often measure catastrophe in terms of human malice, wars, market crashes, the intentional manipulation of interest rates. We like these stories because they imply control. If a man caused it, a man can fix it. But the single greatest economic engine of the 19th century wasn't destroyed by a bank run or a blockade. It was dismantled, bolt by rusted bolt, by biology. We are talking about a biomass calculation that defies standard logistics. In 1875, a physician named Albert Child surveyed a cloud of insects over the Midwest. He wasn't guessing. He used telegraph data and wind speed velocity to triangulate the dimensions. The swarm was 1,800 miles long and 110 miles wide. That is 198,000 square miles of moving hunger. To put that in perspective, that is a surface area larger than the state of California, composed entirely of eating machines. The estimated weight of this swarm was 27.5 million tons. We talk about the American bison as the king of the plains. We romanticize the herds that shook the earth. But if you took every single bison that existed in North America before European contact, every bull, every cow, every calf, and put them on a scale, they would not equal the weight of the Rocky Mountain Locust swarm of 1875. This wasn't a pest problem. This was a geological event, a biological glacier that didn't just eat crops, it ate the economy. It stopped trains. Not by blocking the tracks with bulk, but by greasing the rails with their own crushed viscera until the drive wheels of 40-ton locomotives spun uselessly at full throttle. This is the story of how 12.5 trillion insects executed a hostile takeover of the American West. The date is July 20th, 1874. The location is the Platte River Valley, Nebraska. The temperature is hovering around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity is low, typical for the high plains. The settlers here are operating on razor-thin margins. These are men and women who have leveraged everything on the promise of the Homestead Act. The deal is simple. 160 acres of federal land, practically free if you can improve it and live on it for 5 years. But free is a relative term. To get a farm operational in 1874 required an initial capital outlay of roughly $500. Adjusted for inflation, that is about $14,000 in today's purchasing power. That money went to seed, a John Deere plow, timber for a claim shack, and livestock. Most of these men are carrying debt at interest rates that would make a modern loan shark blush, 2 to 3% per month. That's not per year, per month. They are betting on corn. In July, the corn is waist high. It is the only asset on the balance sheet. If the corn comes in, they pay the bank and buy boots for the winter. If the corn fails, the foreclosure notice is nailed to the door before the first snow. On this specific afternoon, the sky begins to darken. It's not a storm front. There is no cumulonimbus structure. It is a haze, a metallic sheen blocking the sun. The light shifts from a harsh yellow to a bruised purple. The temperature drops. This is a matter of thermodynamics. The sheer density of the cloud is physically insulating the ground from solar radiation. Then comes the sound. It starts as a low-frequency hum, like a distant thresher, and escalates into a mechanical roar. It is the sound of billions of chitinous wings beating against the air. When they hit the ground, it sounds like hail. It sounds like gravel being poured onto a tin roof. But it doesn't stop. They land on the corn. They land on the fence posts. They land on the cattle. A single Rocky Mountain locust, Melanoplus spretus, is not impressive. It looks like your standard grasshopper. But these insects are in a gregarious phase. This is a biological switch. When the population density in their breeding grounds hits a critical threshold, their serotonin levels spike. They change color. They grow larger muscles. They stop being solitary actors and become a hive mind focused on one thing: caloric intake. A swarm this size requires a caloric density that the prairie grass cannot provide. They need carbohydrates. They need the cellulose and sugar found in cultivated crops. When they land in the Platte Valley, they don't just eat the leaves. They eat the stalks. They eat the roots. They bore into the ground to eat the seed. But the horror, the thing that drove men to mental institutions, wasn't just the crop loss. It was the omnivorous nature of the hunger. The locusts ate the wool off of live sheep. Farmers watched as their livestock stood bleeding, shivering, stripped naked in the middle of summer. They ate the harnesses off the horses. The leather was cured with salt and oil, and the locusts stripped it down to the buckles. They ate the handles of shovels and pitchforks. The wood had absorbed the sweat of the farmers. Salt again, and the insects rasped the wood down to splinters to get at the mineral content. This is where the economics of the disaster shift from a bad harvest to total liquidation. A farmer can survive a bad crop. He can borrow against the land. But when the harnesses are gone, you can't hitch the horses. When the horses are too weak from blood loss and stressed to pull, you can't move. When the laundry left on the line is consumed, literally the shirts off their backs, eaten down to the buttons, you have a population that is destitute, naked, and immobile. Let's look at the supply chain logistics. The Union Pacific Railroad was the lifeline of the West. It was the only way to move heavy freight, grain out, coal and timber in. In 1875, the Union Pacific was running 440 steam locomotives. These are 60-ton machines. They operate on friction. Steel wheels on steel rails. The coefficient of friction is low, but sufficient for traction. When the swarm crossed, the tracks, the insects, settled on the warm steel rails. As the locomotive approached, the pilot wheels crushed the insects. The result was a layer of fatty, oily slime. The drive wheels lost adhesion. Engineers reported opening the throttles wide, the pistons pumping furiously, the wheels spinning at 60 miles per hour, but the train was standing still. The grade was less than 1%, but the train couldn't move. They had to stop. The crew had to get out with shovels and sand. They had to clear the tracks by hand, shovel the bugs off, put sand on the rails to create grit, move the train forward 100 yards, and do it again. The schedule collapsed. Perishable goods rotted in the sidings. The mail stopped. The telegraph lines went down, not because the wires were cut, but because the weight of the insects settling on the wires snapped the poles. Communications blackout, logistics failure. The West was effectively under siege. Now, follow the money. Who pays for this? In 1874 and 1875, there is no Federal Emergency Management Agency. There is no crop insurance. The federal government in Washington is paralyzed by the fallout of the Panic of 1873 and the winding down of Reconstruction. They view the Western settlers with a mix of contempt and apathy. The prevailing economic theory is laissez-faire. If you fail, it is a moral failing, not a systemic one. But the scale of the destruction forced a change in the ledger. General Edward Ord, commander of the Department of the Platte, was a man of logistics. He looked at the situation and realized this wasn't a farming problem. It was a refugee crisis. He had thousands of armed, starving men on the frontier. That is a recipe for insurrection. Ord bypassed the bureaucrats. He began issuing army rations to civilians: hardtack, salt pork, blankets, boots. He justified it as preventing a breach of the peace. He was distributing military surplus to keep the labor force from dying. The state governments tried to legislate the bugs out of existence. This is where we see the absolute futility of bureaucracy against biology. The state of Missouri passed the Grasshopper Act. They put a bounty on the insects. The state would pay $1 a bushel for locusts caught in the spring. $1 in 1877 is roughly $28 today. It sounds like good money. It incentivized the population. Farmers stopped farming and started hunting. They dug trenches. They built hopper dozers. contraptions made of sheet metal and tar dragged behind horses to scoop up the bugs. But do the math on the volume. A bushel of locusts is about 60 pounds of biomass. To make a dent in a swarm of 12 trillion, you would need to fill more bushels than there was currency in the state treasury. The payout system collapsed almost immediately. The clerks were overwhelmed. There was fraud, people bringing in dead bugs from other counties. The bounty laws were repealed because they threatened to bankrupt the state governments before they made a statistical difference in the locust population. And then there was the diet. We talk about desperation, but we rarely look at the nutritional adjustments required to survive. The crops were gone. The livestock was dead or dying. The only abundant protein source was the locusts themselves. Entomologists and government officials began publishing cookbooks. They weren't joking. This was official policy. Recipes for locust fritters and grasshopper soup. Professor Charles Riley, the state entomologist of Missouri, tried to rebrand the locust as the sky prawn. He argued that they were crustaceans of the air. He held dinner parties where he served them fried in butter. He noted they had a nutty flavor, similar to chestnut. The caloric value was high, protein and fat, but the psychological barrier was absolute. Settlers would boil their own leather boots for soup before they would eat the bugs. There are reports of families starving to death with millions of pounds of edible protein buzzing outside their windows. It establishes the limit of human rationality. We will die for our cultural taboos. Let's zoom in on the specific mechanism of the Albert's swarm of 1875. This is the apex of the event. Dr. Albert Child, the man who measured it, was a meteorologist by hobby and a physician by trade. He understood rigor. He stood in Plattsmouth, Nebraska, and watched the swarm pass overhead for 5 consecutive days. 5 days. He timed the speed of the insects by watching them pass telegraph poles. He estimated their altitude with a telescope. He calculated the depth of the stream at 1 mile, the width at 110 miles, the length at 1,800 miles. He arrived at the figure of 198,000 square miles. But let's look at the ground-level impact. When a swarm like this lands for the night, the weight breaks trees. We aren't talking about saplings. We are talking about mature cottonwoods and oaks losing limbs as thick as a man's thigh, because the sheer weight of the biomass exceeds the structural integrity of the wood. The heat was another factor. The accumulation of bodies, the friction of movement, and the biological heat output raised the ground temperature. In the cellars, where people hid, the vents had to be stuffed with rags. If a door was left ajar, the house would fill. They got into the bedding. They got into the flour bins. The sheer psychological terror of waking up to find insects eating the hair off your head cannot be quantified in dollars, but it broke the labor force. The suicide rate spiked. Asylum admissions in Kansas and Nebraska hit record highs in 1875. The diagnosis was often listed simply as grasshopper plague. But the most fascinating part of this story is the extinction. Today, the Rocky Mountain Locust is gone. Not just rare, extinct. The last live specimen was seen in 1902. We have specimens preserved in glaciers in Montana, frozen in the ice, perfectly preserved forensic evidence. But the species is dead. How does a population of 12 trillion, a biomass that outweighed the bison, vanish in less than 30 years? It wasn't the bounties. It wasn't the fire trenches. It wasn't the army rations. It was the plow. The weakness of the Rocky Mountain Locust was its breeding ground. They didn't breed on the plains. They bred in the high mountain valleys of the Rockies, the river bottoms of Wyoming and Montana. This was the exact land that the settlers were moving into. The farmers were plowing the river valleys to plant alfalfa and wheat. The locusts laid their eggs in the soil just an inch or two down. These eggs required undisturbed soil to overwinter. When the farmers ran their iron plows through the valleys in the spring and fall, they turned the soil over. They exposed the eggs to the air, to the frost, to the birds. They didn't know they were fighting a war. They were just farming. But acre by acre, furrow by furrow, they physically destroyed the nurseries of the species. It is the only known case in history where an agricultural pest was driven to extinction by the expansion of agriculture itself. It was accidental genocide. The settlers who had been starved out, bankrupt, and broken by the swarm in 1875 ended up killing off the enemy simply by doing the work that the enemy was trying to prevent. The legacy of the 1875 swarm is written in the legal code of the West. The Grasshopper Acts set the precedent for agricultural disaster relief. It forced the federal government to acknowledge that a biological event could threaten national security. It shifted the perception of the farmer from a solitary gambler to a component of the national industrial machine that required protection. Look at the numbers one last time. 12 trillion insects, 27 million tons, $200 million in damage. That is roughly $5.5 billion in today's money. The swarm of 1875 makes the Dust Bowl look like a minor weather event in terms of biomass. It was a war between the Industrial Revolution and the carbon cycle. And in the end, the iron plow won. Not by fighting, but by churning the earth. The next time you see a grasshopper on your lawn, look at it. It is a solitary creature. It is harmless. But inside its genetic code, the mechanism for the swarm still exists in its cousins. The desert locust in Africa still swarms. The capability is there. The only thing missing is the density. We killed the Rocky Mountain Locust, but we didn't kill the physics of the swarm. We just bought ourselves some time. Let's scrutinize the Albert swarm dimensions again, because the math is the only way to truly grasp the horror. Child's calculation of 198,000 square miles is a conservative estimate based on the main body of the cloud. It does not account for the stragglers or the advanced scouts. The density was estimated at 130 million insects per cubic mile. When you run that against the drag coefficient of a moving train, you realize why the locomotives stalled. It wasn't just slippery rails. It was air displacement. The air intakes of the engines would clog. The fireboxes, which needed a precise draft to maintain steam pressure, would choke as insects were sucked into the combustion chambers. The smell of burning insect protein, acrid, oily, distinct, permeated the cabins. Engineers tied handkerchiefs over their faces, not for bandits, but to keep from inhaling the pulverized remains of the swarm. There is a report from a Union Pacific station master in Kearney, Nebraska. He documented that the water tower was unusable. The tank had been left uncovered. The locusts had drowned in it by the millions. The water was a thick, black sludge of decaying chitin and insect fluids. This was the only water source for the boilers. Using it meant foaming in the boiler, which could lead to an explosion. They had to drain the tower, shovel out the sludge, tons of it, and wait for a pump train to bring fresh water from the east. The delay cost the railroad $40,000 in a single week. That is over $1.1 million today. Lost revenue, penalties for late mail, spoilage. The breakdown of the hopper dozer is a lesson in desperate engineering. The design was open source before the term existed. A long strip of sheet iron, usually 10 to 15 feet long. A back wall of canvas or wood. A pan at the bottom filled with coal tar or crude oil. 2 horses pulled it. As it dragged over the fields, the locusts would jump to avoid the bar, hit the back wall, and fall into the tar. The tar trapped them. When the pan was full, the farmer would stop, shovel the black sticky mass of bugs into a pile, set it on fire, and start again. It was grueling, filthy work, and it was dangerous. The horses were panicked by the buzzing. The tar was flammable. Men were burned, but the efficacy was the issue. A farmer could clear 10 bushels of bugs in a day, but while he was clearing 10 bushels, another 1,000 bushels were landing. It was like trying to bail out the Titanic with a teaspoon. The psychological toll of this futile labor cannot be overstated. You work 16 hours a day, your skin stained with tar and bug juice, your muscles screaming, and at the end of the day, there are more bugs than when you started. Let's look at the microscopic damage. The mandibles of the Melanoplus spretus are silica-hardened. They are designed to grind silica-rich grass. When they turned to household items, the damage was forensic. They ate the curtains off the windows. Women rushed to save their best dresses, burying them in chests, only to find the insects had eaten through the wood of the chest and destroyed the fabric inside. They ate the green paint off the siding of houses because the paint contained lead and mineral oil, which the bugs found palatable. Houses were stripped to bare, grey wood in 48 hours. The post-mortem on the 1875 disaster reveals a massive transfer of wealth. The homesteaders were wiped out. They defaulted on their loans. Who held the paper? The Eastern banks, the land speculators, the railroads. These entities foreclosed on thousands of claims. They took the land, improved by the sweat of the ruined farmers, for pennies on the dollar. When the locusts died out and the rain returned, the land values skyrocketed. The disaster consolidated land ownership into the hands of the corporate entities that could weather the storm. The smallholder was the shock absorber for the system. He took the hit, and the bank took the asset. Consider the Grasshopper Army of 1877. This was a federal commission appointed to investigate. They produced a report, huge, dense, full of maps and charts. It is one of the first examples of the federal government using science to combat a natural disaster. They mapped the permanent region, breeding grounds, versus the temporary region, where the swarms went to eat. They identified that the solution wasn't killing the swarm, but destroying the eggs. This scientific approach marked a pivot. We moved from prayer and fasting, which the governors had officially proclaimed in 1874, to entomology and agronomy. We stopped asking God to stop the bugs and started asking the engineers how to kill them. The biological requirement for the phase change, from solitary to swarming, is triggered by touch. When locusts are crowded, the hairs on their hind legs are stimulated. This tactile feedback triggers the hormonal cascade. It is a biological crowd control nightmare. If you keep them apart, they are safe. If you push them together, they become a weapon. The drought of the 1870s was the catalyst. It shrank the vegetation in the Rockies, forcing the bugs into smaller and smaller patches of green. The crowding triggered the change. The drought made the weapon, the wind aimed it, and the farmers were the target. In the end, the 1875 swarm is a case study in the fragility of complex systems. The railroad was a complex system. High finance was a complex system. Agricultural settlement was a complex system. All of them were brought to a halt by a creature that weighs 2 grams. It is a reminder that in the battle between economics and biology, biology always has the first move. The ledger always balances, but sometimes the currency is famine. We stand on the ruins of that disaster. The wheat fields of Kansas and Nebraska feed the world today, but every loaf of bread comes from soil that was once a graveyard for 12 trillion ravenous ghosts. The efficiency of the modern food system is built on the extinction of its greatest rival. We won. But looking at the numbers, the sheer, impossible weight of that swarm, it was a near-run thing. The last recorded sighting of a live Melanoplus spretus was in 1902. A single specimen, never seen again. We wiped out a species that could blot out the sun, and we did it with a plow. That is the power of human engineering. That is the power of the machine. And that is the cold, hard reality of the West.